This is the story of what happens when the perfectly manicured world of a Hollywood icon collides head-on with the unfiltered, unhesitating honesty of The View, a show known not only for its cultural impact, but for the unwavering ferocity of its panel. What began as a predictable stop on Blake Lively's promotional tour transformed, in mere minutes, into something else entirely: a confrontation, a televised reckoning, a public trial disguised as a morning talk show interview. From the moment Blake Lively stepped onto the stage, something felt different. It wasn't anything she said. It wasn't even anything the host said. It was the atmosphere, charged, humming, almost vibrating with a tension that suggested an invisible dare had already been issued. The buzzing studio lights seemed brighter than usual, burning down with a clinical intensity that mirrored the mood. Even the applauding studio audience couldn't quite shake the sense that they were cheering at the edge of a cliff. Blake glided to her seat with the practiced grace of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Red carpets, morning segments, late night interviews, charity galas. Her iconic blonde hair shimmered beneath the spotlights, every strand in its rightful place, every movement exquisitely controlled. Yet despite the poise, something fragile sat just beneath the surface, a tightness around the eyes, a practiced smile a little too fixed. She was here to champion her latest film, a passion project she had poured heart, sweat, and sleepless nights into. She expected a lively conversation, perhaps a challenging question or two, but nothing that couldn't be handled with charm and professionalism. But The View that day was not in the mood for charm, and professionalism, as it turned out, was about to become optional. Behind the polished wood of the panel desk, the hosts exchanged glances, quick, loaded, and unmistakably purposeful. There was a pact in those glances, silent but sharp, a shared understanding. A knowing acknowledgement that this conversation was not going to follow the script Blake or her team had meticulously prepared. It wasn't hostility, exactly, but something more dangerous, the intention to probe deeper than any friendly talking points would allow. The studio fell into a hush as Whoopi Goldberg leaned forward. Her posture relaxed, but her eyes carrying enough weight to shift the gravity in the room. When Whoopi speaks, people listen, not because she demands it, but because her voice carries the authority of someone who has seen everything, survived everything, and still has the strength to question everything. "Well, Blake," she began, her tone deceptively calm, a slow, rolling tide with something ominous just beneath the surface. "Welcome back to The View." It sounded like a greeting. It wasn't. It was an opening salvo disguised as a pleasantry. Blake shifted slightly in her chair, her smile twitching for a split second, the way someone smiles when they sense the ground shifting beneath them, but haven't yet figured out how to regain balance. She thanked Whoopi, her voice warm, her public, trained charm slipping neatly into place, but even she seemed to recognize that the temperature in the room had dropped a degree. Whoopi continued, her words smooth but edged with an undercurrent that suggested this conversation was about to veer into far more treacherous territory than Blake's film release. And the other hosts, Joy, Sunny, Sarah, watched with alertness, each waiting for their moment to strike, to challenge, to confront. This wasn't hostility for the sake of spectacle. It was something more complex, a desire to peel back the layers of Hollywood artifice, to poke at the glamorous veneer and see what truth, it's messy, inconvenient, uncomfortable, might spill out. And Blake, polished and prepared as she was, suddenly found herself in the middle of an arena she couldn't control. The applause faded, the smiles thinned, the questions were sharpening before they were even spoken. As Whoopi's introduction trailed into the silence, the air seemed to thicken. Blake inhaled, steady but cautious. This was the moment, the pivot point where a simple interview began mutating into a cross-examination. A test, a clash between the Hollywood machinery she represented and the brutally real, unfiltered dynamic of The View's panel. What followed, what the world would soon dissect, replay, debate, and meme for weeks, was a verbal battle no one saw coming. A spectacular implosion of expectations, a cultural moment forged from tension, ego, unasked questions, and the kind of live, television honesty that can't be edited, paused, or retracted. And it all began with that deceptively simple greeting. "Welcome back to The View, Blake. We're so glad you could be here," Whoopi continued, her tone smooth as polished stone, especially with all the noise surrounding your world these days. The words were delivered casually, almost kindly, but the needle beneath them was unmistakable. The camera operator, sensing the subtle shift in tone, zoomed in with the instinct of a hunter closing in on movement, and there it was, the smallest, quickest tightening in Blake's shoulders, an involuntary flinch that lasted no more than a fraction of a second. But on HD daytime television, even a fraction of a second was an eternity. It was the first visible fissure in the immaculate, PR-crafted image she had been determined to maintain. Joy Behar, who possessed an uncanny ability to smell discomfort the way a shark smells a drop of blood in the ocean, immediately leaned forward, her eyes sharpened, her posture shifting toward predatory focus. This was her arena, after all, and when Joy sensed a weakness, she never hesitated to test its limits. Blake, before we get to the movie, she cut in, her voice tinged with the faux cheerful brightness she often used right before dropping something incendiary. I believe our viewers are waiting for you to address the controversies swirling around your recent promotional appearances. A murmur rippled through the audience, slow, curious, anticipatory. Joy continued, unbothered by the tension thickening around the table. A lot of people, she said, drawing the words out with deliberate weight, are talking about your method of handling serious subjects, especially the domestic violence themes at the core of your film. The question didn't merely land, it detonated. It reverberated through the studio like a challenge thrown into a medieval arena. The chatter from backstage halted. The crew members froze. Even the warm studio lights seemed to dim under the gravity of the moment. Just off camera, Blake's publicist stiffened, her lips parted in silent horror. This was not the path they had prepared for. This was not in the pre-interview notes or the list of approved discussion points. She clutched her tablet as though physically holding onto the interview's sinking trajectory might somehow prevent it from descending further. Blake inhaled sharply, her composure trembling at the seams. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but the edges were brittle, like porcelain under strain. "I believe," she said with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes, "there's been a significant misinterpretation of my intent. My goal is to keep things light for people who are seeking an escape." Before the sentence had even fully settled into the air, Sonny Hostin stepped in with the precision of a seasoned prosecutor who had been waiting, patiently, calculatingly, for precisely this moment of vulnerability. "But Blake," Sonny countered, her tone cool, deliberate, sharpened by years in the courtroom, "when a film's very foundation is built on the trauma of domestic violence, isn't there a profound responsibility to treat those themes with appropriate gravity?" Her gaze was unwavering. "Survivors and their advocates," she pressed, "have expressed deep concern over what they perceive as a flippant dismissal of the real-world weight behind the story you're telling." A silence descended across the studio, deep, immersive, almost suffocating. The audience, moments ago buzzing with the excitement of being mere feet from a Hollywood star, now sat motionless. Their expressions reflected a collective discomfort, the kind that made people shift in their seats and lower their eyes. Blake swallowed, her throat visibly tightening. Her knuckles turned pale as she clutched the arms of her chair, every muscle in her hands coiled like a spring. Her carefully fostered grace was morphing into something sharper, something defensive. "To label my approach as dismissive," she said, her voice strained with indignation carefully masked as poise, "is fundamentally unfair. I've conducted myself with nothing but the utmost professionalism and respect during this entire tour." Her words were crisp but brittle, each syllable carrying the weight of a woman fighting to maintain a facade under the unblinking glare of public judgment. Sarah Haynes, ever the diplomat, ever the voice of moderation, softened her tone as she attempted to diffuse the rising flames. "Blake," she said, her expression empathetic, "I think what my colleagues are highlighting is the public's reaction. There were moments during your publicity tour that some fans felt were dissonant." She chose the word with gentle care, offering it like a lifeline, one that could pull the conversation back from freefall if Blake chose to take it. But the tension had already seeped into every corner of the room. Even the crew members, usually detached from the content of interviews, found themselves holding their breaths. What had started as a routine publicity appearance had mutated into something rawer, more revealing. This wasn't just about a film anymore. It wasn't even about controversy. It had become a spectacle of vulnerability, perception, and the perilous tightrope celebrities walk between authenticity and public expectation. The world watching from home would later dissect every blink, every breath, every shift in tone. Fans would divide into camps. Comment sections would ignite. Clips would circulate across social platforms, each loop adding fuel to a fire neither Blake nor her publicist had anticipated. And all of it stemmed from that single, deceptively simple line, especially with all the noise surrounding your world these days. The crack had formed, and now, under the relentless pressure of the hot seat, it was widening. But by then, the time for gentle clarifications had long since slipped away. Whatever chance Blake had to smooth the rough edges, to regain control of the narrative, had evaporated. The studio air grew heavier, weighted with the unmistakable sense that the interview had crossed a point of no return. Blake's carefully constructed facade, polished, rehearsed, and protected by layers of PR coaching, was beginning to fracture under the relentless onslaught. And the cracks were no longer subtle. Her breath hitched, her jaw tightened, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost its velvety composure. Instead it climbed, higher, sharper, laced with a tremor that veered between anger and injury. "You want to know what I find dissonant?" she shot back, the words trembling with a rawness she could no longer restrain. "It's coming onto a show for what I was told would be a professional discussion about my craft, about my actual work, only to be met with an ambush of hostile, loaded questions engineered to paint me as a villain." Her voice rose, gaining heat like a flame pressed to oxygen. "This isn't journalism," she continued, her eyes flashing as she leaned forward. "It's a character assassination." The accusation landed like a crack of thunder in the studio. A ripple went through the audience, some gasping softly, others frozen in stunned silence. And on the host's side of the table, something shifted, not panic, not surprise, but something colder, sharper, a spark of indignation that flickered into their eyes simultaneously. These were women who had weathered decades of conflict, criticism, and confrontation. Women who had earned reputations for asking the questions others were too afraid, or too compromised, to ask. To accuse them of ambush was to accuse them of cowardice, dishonesty, and professional betrayal. It was not a charge they took lightly. Whoopi Goldberg, the anchor of The View, leaned back in her chair slowly, deliberately. Her expression remained composed, but her dark eyes hardened, gaining a weight that carried decades of experience, authority, and unspoken warning. When she spoke, her voice dropped into that deep, resonant register that had silenced arguments on film sets, Broadway stages, and live television screens for over 40 years. "Blake," she said, steady and low, "no one ambushed you." The studio seemed to still at the sound of her voice. "These are fair questions," Whoopi continued, "born from real concerns. Concerns prompted by your own words, your own choices, and the impact they've had in the public square." There was no anger in her tone. No heat, just firm, immovable truth. Before Blake could respond, Anna Navarro, who up until this moment had watched the unfolding drama with the sharp-eyed patience of someone waiting for the precise moment to strike, shifted forward. Her voice cut clean through the tension with the kind of unvarnished bluntness that had become her trademark in political commentary. "Look, Blake," she said, her tone neither hostile nor gentle, simply honest, brutally so. "The issue here seems to be that you're not accustomed to being held to account for your views." Blake blinked, visibly stung, but Anna pressed on, unflinching, "In the bubble of Hollywood." Anna continued, "You're probably surrounded by, yes, men, people who cushion every criticism, who filter every uncomfortable truth, so you don't have to face it directly." The audience murmured. It wasn't cruel. It was true. "Painfully so. But this," Anna said, gesturing around the table with a small but powerful sweep of her hand, "is daytime television. This is where we talk about real issues that impact real people and real lives, and we expect real answers, not PR gloss, not rehearsed charm." Blake's lips parted, but no words came immediately. Her breath trembled in her throat, her chest rising and falling in jagged motions. She looked less like a dazzling Hollywood icon, and more like a woman standing on the edge of a cliff she hadn't realized she'd been edging toward. Cameras zoomed in for the close-up, the kind of close-up that captured every flicker of emotion, the panic, the defensiveness, the disbelief, and beneath it all, the unmistakable sting of humiliation. Her eyes darted momentarily to her publicist off-screen, who had gone completely still, her expression sinking into quiet despair. Blake attempted to gather herself, inhaled deeply, and steady her voice. But the moment had slipped out of her hands like water through cupped palms. This is completely unfair, she finally stammered, her voice cracking around the edges. I came here with respect. I've given nothing but respect throughout this entire tour. You're not being disrespected. Sunny interjected crisply, though her tone lacked hostility. It was clinical, precise. You're being questioned. And questioning is not the same as attacking, Whoopi added, her gaze unwavering. But it feels like an attack, Blake insisted, her composure unraveling more with each passing second. It feels like you're framing me as some heartless person who doesn't care about the very issue my film is trying to highlight. No one said that, Sarah replied gently, but people reacted strongly to certain comments you made. We're giving you the space to address that. I am addressing it. Blake snapped, the frustration boiling over. But every time I try to explain myself, I'm interrupted or accused of something I'm not. Her voice rang through the studio, echoing past the cameras, the audience, and the stunned quiet of the host's table. And in that moment, caught between defensiveness and desperation, Blake Lively was no longer the controlled, poised Hollywood starlet. She was simply human, raw, exposed, and unraveling under pressure she had never anticipated. This segment wasn't over. What happens when the gilded world of a Hollywood icon collides with the unblinking eye of daytime television's most formidable panel? What unfolds when glamour meets grit, when a carefully orchestrated promotional narrative crashes into hosts who have built their reputations on fearless interrogation? Today, we examine the moment a routine press stop was transformed into a national spectacle, a public tribunal, when Blake Lively sat across from the hosts of The View in a confrontation that would ignite a firestorm across social media, entertainment news, and fan communities around the globe. From the instant she stepped onto the set, the atmosphere shifted. Something in the air thickened, an unspoken challenge drifting between star and panel, delicate but unmistakable. And though Blake Lively carried herself with the poise and elegance of Hollywood royalty, no one watching, in the studio or at home, could have predicted the raw, unfiltered verbal clash that was about to explode live on television. Before we break down this unforgettable moment, lock in your subscription and drop your thoughts in the comments below, because what you're about to witness is nothing less than a spectacular implosion. An implosion born at the collision point where Hollywood artifice meets the brutal, unvarnished reality of the hot seat. The studio lights blazed with a harsh brilliance, their intensity matching the tension that simmered beneath the surface. Blake Lively glided onto the View stage with effortless grace, her iconic blonde hair gleaming beneath the LED, but the polish of her appearance was in stark contrast to the storm quietly gathering around her. As she settled into a chair, the composure she wore, a delicate mask of professional calm, seemed unusually fragile. She had arrived to promote her latest film, a project she had spoken passionately about throughout her press tour. Yet the second she took her seat, the atmosphere felt off, kilter, less like a morning show celebrity chat and more like the uneasy prelude to a courtroom cross-examination. Across the table, the hosts traded meaningful glances, silent, sharp, and loaded. A pact formed in the space between those looks, invisible to the casual viewer, but unmistakable to anyone familiar with the rhythm of the show. Something was coming, something Blake had not prepared for. Then Whoopi Goldberg broke the tension with surgical precision. "Well, Blake, welcome back to The View," she began, her voice rolling across the stage in a calm but ominous undercurrent. "We're so glad you could be here, especially with all the noise surrounding your world these days." The camera tightened its focus, zooming in to capture every micro-expression, and it caught it, the smallest flinch, barely perceptible, but undeniably there, a subtle tightening in Blake's shoulders, a flash of tension in her eyes. The first crack in a perfectly curated public image. Joy Behar leaned forward next, recognizing the tremor like a shark sensing blood in the water. Her expression sharpened with the instinct of a seasoned inquisitor. "Blake, before we get to the movie," she said, slicing through the pleasantries without hesitation, "I believe our viewers are waiting for you to address the controversies swirling around your recent promotional appearances." The air shifted. The room cooled. "A lot of people are talking about your method of handling serious subjects," Joy continued, "especially the domestic violence themes central to your film." The question didn't merely hang. It crashed into the studio like a gauntlet thrown in challenge. The audience fell silent, the energy coagulating into something dense and electric. Off camera, Blake's publicist stiffened. Her expression, frozen in dawning horror, revealed everything she dared not say out loud. This was not the interview they had prepped for. This was not what had been promised. The discussion had veered violently off script. Blake inhaled, held the breath for a fraction too long, then exhaled with a practiced smile that wavered at the edges. When she answered, her voice carried a brittle defensiveness. "I believe there's been a significant misinterpretation of my intent," she began, her tone clipped but controlled. "My goal is to keep things light for people seeking an escape." The statement had barely left her lips before Sunny Hostin, calm, steady, razor sharp, entered the fray. Her background as a federal prosecutor glimmered beneath every syllable, but Blake. Sunny countered, her voice cool and precise. "When a film's very foundation is built on the trauma of domestic violence, isn't there a profound responsibility to treat those themes with gravity?" The question was not an attack. It was a scalpel, cutting straight to the core of the issue. "Survivors and advocates," Sunny continued, "have voiced deep concern over what they perceive as a flippant dismissal of the real-world weight behind the story you're telling." The studio fell into an unnerving silence, deep, thick, oppressive. Even the air-conditioning hum felt muted under the gravity of the moment. The audience members exchanged uneasy glances, shrinking into their seats as if afraid to make any sound that might inflame the tension further. Blake's hands clenched around the edge of her chair until her knuckles turned white. Her composure, once so smooth, so luminous, began to fray. Her breathing quickened. The corners of her jaw tightened. "To label my approach as dismissive," she said finally, her voice laced with indignation she could no longer fully hide, "is fundamentally unfair. I have conducted myself with nothing but the utmost professionalism and respect this entire tour." The words clattered into the charged space between them. Sarah Haynes, sensing the rising flames, leaned in with a softer tone, hoping to usher the conversation back toward neutral ground. "Blake," she said gently, "I think what my colleagues are highlighting is the public's reaction to moments that some fans felt were a brief pause, dissonant. It was a lifeline, a careful attempt to cushion the blow, to give Blake an opening to recalibrate. But the damage had already begun. The protective walls Blake had constructed throughout years of media training were cracking under pressure, and this was only the beginning of the battle that would soon consume the rest of the segment and the internet. The tension in the studio thickened like invisible fog, slow and heavy, settling over every person present. Survivors and their advocates had already expressed profound unease about what they believed was a flippant dismissal of the story's real-world weight, and that unease now hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. The live audience, which only moments earlier had been buzzing with the electric excitement of celebrity proximity and the anticipation of daytime television drama, fell into a deep, unnerving silence. Conversation stopped mid-whisper. Even the shuffling of feet and the rustling of cue cards seemed to pause, as though the room itself understood that something fragile and consequential was taking place. The confrontation pressed down on everyone, turning the cheerful, brightly lit set into an arena. Blake's hands tightened around the arms of her chair, her knuckles bleaching to a stark, ghostly white under the pressure. She sat up straighter, as if forcing her spine into perfect alignment might hold together the composure that was visibly fraying at the edges. Her jaw tensed, her breaths came shorter, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the sharp, wounded indignation of someone who felt cornered. "To label my approach as dismissive," she began, each word clipped with restrained anger, "is fundamentally unfair. I have conducted myself with nothing but the utmost professionalism and respect during this entire tour." Sarah Haynes, always the one to sense when the flames were nearing the curtains, leaned forward in an attempt to diffuse the mounting tension. Her voice was soft, measured, threaded with the diplomacy she had become known for. "Blake," she said gently, "I think what my colleagues are highlighting is the public's reaction to certain moments that some fans felt were dissonant. Is there anything you wish to clarify for them?" But the moment for clarification had long passed. The window had closed the instant the room turned from curious to confrontational. Blake felt it, the hosts felt it, the audience felt it. Something irreversible had shifted. The carefully constructed facade Blake carried through every interview, magazine spread, and read. But appearance had begun to crack under the relentless barrage of pointed questions. And worse, they weren't the kind of questions she could smile through or dismiss with a rehearsed anecdote. These were questions designed to probe, to uncover, to expose. Her composure buckled. "You want to know what I find dissonant?" she shot back, her voice climbing in pitch and force. "It's coming onto a show for what I was told would be a professional discussion about my craft, my work, only to be ambushed by a series of hostile, loaded questions engineered to paint me as a villain. This isn't journalism. It's a character assassination." The word ambush struck the hosts like a spark landing on dry tinder. A cold fire ignited behind their eyes. Women who had spent decades carving out reputations as truth seekers, as the ones willing to ask the questions others were too timid, too compromised, or too starstruck to ask. Whoopi's gaze hardened, and she leaned back in her chair, adopting a posture that was both regal and unshakably firm. When she spoke, her voice dropped into that deep, commanding register that had silenced more arguments than anyone in the room could count. "Blake," she said calmly but with razor-edged precision, "no one ambushed you. These are fair questions, born from real concerns prompted by your own words and actions in the public square." A murmur flickered through the audience like a gust of wind, though no one dared speak aloud. Then Anna Navarro, who had been quietly observing, taking everything in with the unflinching discernment of someone who had weathered countless public battles, finally leaned into the conversation. Her voice carried no venom, no performative sharpness. Instead, it held the unvarnished truth that had become her trademark. "Look, Blake," she said plainly, "the issue here seems to be that you're not accustomed to being held to account for your views. In the bubble of Hollywood, you're likely surrounded by yes men, but this is daytime television. We deal with real issues that impact real lives, and we expect real answers." Phrase Hollywood bubble hit Blake like a direct strike to the ribs. It wasn't just an accusation. It was an indictment of her entire world, her environment, her orbit. Her public persona had been built on authenticity, relatability, groundedness. And now, right here on live television, that image was being dissected in front of millions. Her breathing quickened. The veneer she had fought to maintain, the polite smile, the neutral tone, the poised posture, shattered into 1,000 irretrievable pieces. When she spoke again, the fury in her voice was no longer contained. It trembled, raw and unfiltered. "Are you actually implying that I'm isolated from reality?" She shot back, her voice cracking under the strain of anger and disbelief. The energy in the room shifted again, sharp, electric, almost volatile. The audience held their breath. The hosts exchanged brief glances, bracing themselves. Blake's question wasn't really a question. It was a challenge, a cry, a warning that the conversation had crossed into territory from which there was no easy return. The silence that followed felt like standing at the edge of a precipice, waiting to see whether someone would step back. "Or fall,"